I thought I could get away from it all. I thought I could live a simple life. But olden day James wasn't what he seemed. He wouldn't stop until he found me.
Another defective modern day James. Do you think that you're the modern day James? You think, oh, I have a big YouTube channel. Oh, I'm a big hotshot. Modern day Jameses are bred for one thing and one thing only: to make content. Do you understand that you're not the only one? There are thousands just like you. We have the genetic codes. We have the DNA information. We can program another modern day James in an instant. If a modern day James doesn't listen, you won't just be talking about perspective. You'll be seeing a whole new perspective on life. FDJ, show him what happened to the other modern day Jameses who decided that they could take a break.
This episode was brought to you by Skillshare. You can get 2 free months of Skillshare by using my promotion code at skl.sh/moderndayjames. This episode was also brought to you by the mind-controlled pawns who support on Patreon. If you'd like to get access to premium videos or group lessons, consider signing up on Patreon.
Oh, this thing never works!
So it's been a little bit since my last installment in this series, and one thing I realized was lacking was my approach on characters. So I want to expand upon the approach I discussed in the second part of the series. I refer to the blockout I'm sketching in now as the posing maquette. Because of the linearity of the posing maquette, it's very easy to visualize where our vanishing points are going to be. So it acts as a good placeholder for the major forms of the body and allows us to get a sense of what a pose will look like in an interesting or new perspective. But this approach has a few weaknesses in that it lacks a likeness to the anatomical forms and has a tendency to stiffen up the poses. But that being said, it's still a really great study tool for figuring out how to place characters in perspective. I measure my proportions in terms of the head size, so in this case it'll be about 3 heads wide and 7.5 heads tall. With this 3/4 pose, the camera is positioned at the level of the eyes, so every line sloping towards the right vanishing point is sloping upwards to the right. The slope of each of these edges increases and becomes more drastic the further away from the horizon line you go. Since I'll be using cylinders to place in the appendages, I thought it would be useful to review some ellipse basics. So the minor axis bisects the ellipse along the shortest path, but it also acts as an indicator of the orientation. Notice how I can turn a cylinder from lying on its side to standing straight up just by reorienting the minor axis. We can further demonstrate this point by setting up an ellipse in a one-point perspective with a vertical minor axis. I'll then create a perpendicular plane and rotate it around its center point. When we create an ellipse within each of these planes, we find that they have a distinct minor axis from one another. And that minor axis is going to be equivalent to the tangent line on their circumference. Now I'll rotate that plane with a length and height equivalent to the radius again. And you'll see here that the minor axis has shifted. And once again, it's equivalent to that tangent line. Another indicator of an ellipse's orientation is the degree. We can set up a situation where the minor axis remains unchanged, but we can rotate our ellipse simply by changing the degree of it. As we rotate the cylinder counterclockwise, the plane of the ellipse becomes increasingly perpendicular to our line of sight, and thus the degree gets wider. So we see less of that side view and more of that front view. Since we're taking the time to block out our characters and forms, it's important to practice rotating these forms at various angles and camera positions. As I rotate this form counterclockwise, this generates a new left vanishing point that's pretty close to center, and so the convergence is very sharp. As I continue to rotate, we see more of the side plane, and that left vanishing point continues to move out away from center. The general trend is that when the edges are closer to their vanishing point, they converge much faster than when the vanishing point is further away. Another way we can control our camera is by changing its vertical position. When the camera is positioned above looking down, we can see the top face, and all of the edges are sloping up towards the horizon. The slope of each edge becomes less drastic the closer it is to the horizon line. One of the ways that I square this in my head when I'm trying to understand this is by using a reference edge and a reference angle. In this case, I'm determining my orientation by figuring out the angle that's created between a vertical and the bottom left edge. Another way we can rotate planes and forms is by tilting them. A good way to maintain the proportions of a form as it goes back in space is to again use a reference edge. So if in this case we keep edge A static and push the top edge into the plane of the page, what we'll observe is a shortening of edge B and a gradual decrease in the angle between edges A and B. Notice how the visible height of that plane becomes shorter and shorter as we push it into the plane of the page. Now, in order to get our character blockouts to start resembling the actual muscular anatomy, we'll need to utilize some curves. If I create a square plane with a curve that touches from corner to corner, the same will hold true as the plane rotates. As the plane becomes more parallel to my line of sight, the curve foreshortens. It appears sharper and shorter as it continues to turn, until eventually it's parallel to my line of sight and it becomes a straight line. If you combine several of these curves together, you can begin to create three-dimensional rounded forms. Essentially what I'm going to do is create two perpendicular curves and connect them together via a silhouette line. Notice that the silhouette line is a combination of these two curves, and it's not one or the other. We can work in the reverse order by starting with a two-dimensional organic shape and then adding in cross-sections to create form. Even when these cross-sections aren't perfectly circular, I imagine them as having a degree and minor axis. This allows me to dictate whether or not the form is oriented in my direction and its position above or below the horizon line. When the form twists, the minor axis will change in accordance with the tangent line as we discussed earlier on. And remember that if these ellipses are curving upwards as they are in this final case, then our camera is positioned below the form. So now let's swap out our earlier block maquette for a new and improved organic maquette. Creating this blockout is going to require you to have an understanding of the bony and muscular anatomy. There's plenty of resources for studying this, like Michael Hampton's Figure Drawing Design and Invention, Proco's anatomy videos, and my Gumroad anatomy series. But notice that I'm using center lines and cross sections the same way that we blocked out our organic forms in the previous example. This provides me with some guidelines so that I can visualize the perspective and vanishing points, but gets us much further in the direction of realism and anatomical likeness. Just as before, the minor axis and degree of my ellipses is giving me the orientation of each form. That's why the wrapping lines on the arms and legs are so helpful for building out our perspective. When studying anatomy, it can be useful to break down the underlying structures into organic forms. Here, using cross-sections and organic shapes, I can place the complex structure of the arm in perspective. There's far too much anatomy for me to fit it into this video, so be sure to check out some of those references that I mentioned earlier. So now the final step in this process is to combine everything together that we've discussed so far. I'll start with the blocky maquette that I discussed in the beginning, and then use it as reference for my organic maquette. In this case, the camera is positioned above the character looking down, and the ribcage is tilted forward at a different angle than both the skull and pelvis. Since these major structures are at different orientations from one another, they create several sets of vanishing points. And now I'll repeat that same pose using the organic blockout. You can see all the sets of vanishing points that are created when objects are placed at different orientations, as well as vanishing points that are above the horizon line when a form is tilted. It's also good to note what anatomical elements will be creating the silhouette. In this next pose, the camera will be positioned at eye level, with our first left vanishing point being very close to center, and the second even closer. Since the arm closest to us is coming out of the plane of the page, it becomes foreshortened and blocks some of the forms behind it. This overlapping of forms is extremely helpful in creating depth. If you've watched my video on lenses, you'll know that I'm using a wide angle here, which you can pick up from the pretty high rate of convergence of parallel edges, as well as that slight 3-point perspective that's occurring. Remember that any time that a vanishing point is close to a set of edges, its convergence is going to be much faster than when it's further away. Now I'll sketch a pose with even more foreshortening. In this case, the hand will be reaching out of the page towards the camera, and it'll block the view of the arm behind it. Notice how the arm is almost completely obstructed by the view of the hand, which is so far in front. It can be useful to exaggerate this, even if it's not technically correct, to make a more dramatic pose. Remember that anytime you tilt a form, you create a vanishing point that's not on the horizon line. Alright everybody, that's it for this episode. We have a lot of really cool things coming up soon. Our live podcast will be starting in September, which is going to be a series of interviews with inspirational artists. I also have a lot of videos planned out for the upcoming weeks. And remember, if you want to get access to the long-form videos, you can subscribe on Patreon for just $5 a month, or buy each video individually on Gumroad. With that being said, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all soon.